U.S. launches military strikes in Venezuela and reports capture of President Maduro and wife January 3, 2026. Caracas and Washington, D.C. In an extraordinary escalation of tensions earlier today, the United States launched a large-scale military strike against Venezuela that the U.S. government says resulted in the capture of Venezuelan President Nicolás Maduro and his wife, First Lady Cilia Flores. The operation has sparked global reactions, intense debate over international law, and deep uncertainty about the political future of Venezuela. CBS News Plus One, what happened? In the early hours of January 3rd, explosions and gunfire were reported across Caracas and key Venezuelan military sites, including the Fort Tiuna complex and La Carlota Air Base. Smoke was seen rising over the capital as residents reported loud blasts. CBS News Plus One. Shortly after, U.S. President Donald Trump announced on social media that U.S. forces had executed a large-scale strike in Venezuela and had captured President Maduro and his wife, flying them out of the country. Trump described the operation as a success and said further details would be provided at a planned press conference. CBS News Plus One, claims of capture and custody. According to U.S. officials, elite special forces, including the U.S. Army's Delta Force, participated in the raid, targeting Maduro's strongholds in Caracas. The U.S. Attorney General said the Maduros would face criminal charges in U.S. courts, including narco-terrorism and drug trafficking, based on long-standing federal indictments. CBS News Plus One, Maduro's government has denied the accuracy of the U.S. narrative, with Vice President Delcy Rodriguez demanding proof of life and saying Venezuelan authorities do not know their whereabouts. AP News, why it happened. The Trump administration has for months intensified pressure on Caracas, accusing Maduro's government of involvement in drug trafficking, corrupt governance, and harm to regional security. This included sanctions, seizure of Venezuelan-linked ships, and airstrikes targeting alleged drug trafficking operations around Venezuela. CBS News President Trump and senior U.S. officials portrayed the capture of Maduro as an effort to remove what they describe as a criminal regime that they say has terrorized its own people and harmed U.S. interests. International reactions and legal questions. The U.S. military action has elicited strong global responses. Brazil, a major neighbor, condemned the operation as crossing an unacceptable line and a violation of Venezuelan sovereignty. Reuters. The United Nations expressed alarm and urged respect for international law. Tribune242.com. China and Russia criticized the U.S., calling the strikes an act of aggression. Tribune242.com. Some U.S. political figures defended the strike, while others questioned whether it violated U.S. law or presidential authority. Scholars and diplomats are already debating the legality of the intervention under international law, as well as the absence of explicit congressional authorization for the military action. Situation on the ground in Venezuela. Inside Venezuela, the atmosphere is tense and uncertain. There have been reports of civilian fear, mixed reactions, and protests, with some Venezuelans demanding Maduro's return. Neighboring countries are bracing for possible spillover effects, including refugees or wider conflict. AP News, with Maduro and his wife reportedly in U.S. custody, questions remain about who will lead Venezuela next. Opposition figures, including Maria Corina Machado, are being discussed as possible transitional leaders, though no formal transfer of power has been confirmed. Financial Times. What's next? President Trump's scheduled press conference later today is expected to provide more details on the precise chain of command for the operation, legal charges against Maduro, and Cilia Flores' U.S. intentions for Venezuela's future governance policy on Venezuelan oil assets and regional security. The world will also watch how Venezuela's government and international institutions respond in the coming hours and days. Summary. The U.S. military strike in Venezuela and the reported capture of President Maduro and his wife represent a dramatic escalation in U.S.-Venezuela tensions. It raises critical issues of international law, regional stability, and the future of Venezuelan leadership. CBS News Plus One. Would you like a timeline of events leading up to this strike, or a breakdown of the international legal implications of the U.S. action, power vacuum, and internal fallout? With President Nicolás Maduro and First Lady Cilia Flores reportedly removed from the country, Venezuela is facing its most severe leadership vacuum in decades. Senior figures within the ruling United Socialist Party of Venezuela, PSUV, were reportedly placed under military protection or went into hiding as uncertainty spread through the capital. State television went off air temporarily following the strikes, later resuming broadcasts with pre-recorded programming and patriotic music. No official successor has been named, and the Venezuelan Supreme Court has not issued a ruling clarifying constitutional succession, deepening confusion over who holds legitimate authority. Several military commanders released brief statements calling for calm and national unity, but avoided confirming Maduro's status. Analysts say the stance of the armed forces will be decisive in determining whether the government collapses or reorganizes. Humanitarian and economic impact. The strikes caused limited but significant infrastructure damage, particularly around military installations and transportation hubs. Venezuelan authorities reported civilian casualties, though independent verification remains difficult due to communications disruptions. Oil markets reacted immediately. Venezuelan crude exports were suspended, pushing global oil prices higher amid fears of prolonged instability in one of the world's largest proven oil reserve holders. The U.S. Treasury Department announced temporary controls on Venezuelan assets abroad, including state-owned oil company PDVSA, pending political clarification. Humanitarian organizations warned that further instability could worsen Venezuela's already dire humanitarian crisis, marked by shortages of food, medicine, and electricity. Legal proceedings in the United States. U.S. officials confirmed that Maduro and Flores are expected to face federal charges, including narcotics trafficking, corruption, and money laundering. Maduro has been under U.S. indictment since 2020, with American authorities previously offering a multi-million-dollar reward for information leading to his arrest. Legal experts note that bringing a sitting or recently removed foreign head of state into U.S. custody is virtually unprecedented and could set a far-reaching international legal precedent. Defense attorneys are expected to challenge jurisdiction, extradition legality in the circumstances of the capture. Global diplomatic crisis emergency meetings were convened at the United Nations Security Council, where several countries accused the United States of violating international law and national sovereignty. The U.S. delegation defended the action as a necessary step against what it described as a criminal narco-state leadership. Latin American governments are deeply divided. Some quietly welcomed the removal of Maduro, while others warned the action could destabilize the entire region and normalize foreign military intervention against sovereign governments. What comes next for Venezuela? Political observers say Venezuela now stands at a crossroads. A transitional government backed by opposition forces and international recognition, a military-led interim council seeking to maintain order, or prolonged internal conflict if factions compete for power. Opposition leaders called for internationally supervised elections, while urging the United States to avoid long-term military involvement. Conclusion: the U.S. strike and reported capture of Nicolás Maduro and his wife mark a historic turning point for Venezuela and for U.S. foreign policy in Latin America. While supporters see the operation as the end of an authoritarian era, critics warn it may open the door to prolonged instability and global diplomatic fallout. As events continue to unfold, the future of Venezuela and the broader implications for international norms remain uncertain. Military response and security measures. In the hours following the strikes, Venezuelan armed forces increased their presence across major cities, setting up checkpoints and restricting access to government buildings, airports, and broadcast facilities. Flights in and out of Venezuela were suspended indefinitely, and borders with Colombia and Brazil were partially closed as a precautionary measure. Defense officials said the military was operating under a national security alert, but stopped short of declaring martial law. Analysts note that the loyalty of mid-level officers and regional commanders will be critical, as fragmentation within the armed forces could lead to internal clashes or localized uprisings. Reports from Caracas indicated sporadic gunfire overnight, though no large-scale fighting was confirmed. Internet access remained unstable, and social media platforms were intermittently blocked. Public reaction inside Venezuela, public reaction across Venezuela has been deeply divided. In some neighborhoods, residents were seen celebrating what they described as the end of years of repression and economic hardship. In other areas, particularly those aligned with the ruling party, protests erupted condemning the U.S. action as a foreign invasion. Families rushed to stock up on food, fuel, and cash as banks limited withdrawals and several supermarkets closed early. Long lines formed at gas stations, despite government assurances that fuel supplies were secure. Human rights organizations urge all parties to protect civilians and avoid reprisals, warning that political score settling could lead to arbitrary arrests or violence. Regional security concerns. Neighboring countries placed their armed forces on heightened alert, fearing instability could spill across borders. Colombia reinforced its frontier regions, while Caribbean nations increased maritime patrols amid concerns about refugee flows and trafficking disruptions. The Organization of American States, OAS, called for an emergency summit to discuss the crisis, urging dialogue and restraint. Several governments emphasized that any political transition in Venezuela must be Venezuelan-led, even as they acknowledged the dramatic shift in power dynamics. U.S. position and future strategy. U.S. officials stressed that the operation was limited in scope and not intended to result in long-term occupation. They stated that American forces would withdraw once immediate security objectives were met, though no timeline was provided. Washington also indicated it would work with international partners to support a democratic transition, including humanitarian assistance and potential sanctions relief if a recognized interim government is established. Critics within the United States, however, raised concerns about escalation, warning that unintended consequences could draw the U.S. deeper into another prolonged foreign crisis. Uncertain path forward. As Venezuela enters an uncharted phase, the absence of clear leadership and constitutional direction leaves the country vulnerable to instability. Whether this moment leads to democratic reform, military control, or prolonged turmoil will depend on decisions made in the coming days by Venezuelan institutions, regional actors, and the international community. For millions of Venezuelans, the immediate concern remains safety, access to food and medicine, and the hope that the country's long political and economic crisis may finally move toward resolution rather than deeper conflict. As uncertainty deepens, analysts are outlining several possible short-term scenarios for Venezuela, none of which are guaranteed and all dependent on decisions made by domestic actors in the coming days. Scenario 1. Negotiated Transitional Authority. Under this outcome, senior military leaders and opposition figures could agree on a temporary governing council, backed by international mediation. This would likely involve commitments to early elections, restoration of civil liberties, and phased sanctions relief. While viewed by many diplomats as the least disruptive path, it requires unity among Venezuelan power brokers, something that has historically been difficult to achieve. Scenario 2. Military consolidation. A second possibility is the emergence of a military-led administration claiming to maintain order. Supporters argue this could prevent chaos. Critics warn it would entrench authoritarian control under a different structure, delaying any democratic transition. Scenario 3. Fragmentation and prolonged instability. If no consensus forms, Venezuela could face competing claims to authority, regional power centers, and sustained unrest. Economists warn this would accelerate currency collapse, deepen shortages, and increase outward migration. Human rights and accountability concerns. International human rights groups are closely monitoring reports of detentions, disappearances, and use of force during the security crackdown. They have called for independent monitoring of detention facilities, protection for journalists and civil society leaders, guarantees against collective punishment or political reprisals. Any future government, analysts say, will face pressure to address alleged abuses from both past and present actors, raising sensitive questions about truth, justice, and reconciliation. Economic stakes and reconstruction debate. Beyond immediate stability, Venezuela's longer-term recovery looms large. Policy experts emphasize that restoring oil production, stabilizing the currency, and rebuilding basic services would require institutional reforms at PDVSA re-engagement with international financial institutions. Anti-corruption safeguards to attract investment debate is already underway about whether frozen assets should be used for humanitarian relief, debt restructuring, or infrastructure repair. Public mood, hope mixed with fear. On the streets, interviews and social media posts reflect a conflicted public mood, hope that change may finally come, paired with fear of violence or disappointment. Many Venezuelans say they are withholding judgment until there is clarity about who governs and how. For families who have endured years of shortages and immigration, expectations are cautious. "We've seen announcements before," one resident said. "What matters is whether life actually improves." Looking ahead, the next 48 to 72 hours are expected to be decisive. Key indicators to watch include statements from senior military leadership, any formal announcement on interim governance, international recognition or mediation efforts, conditions on the ground for civilians. Until then, Venezuela remains in a fragile holding pattern, with outcomes that could reshape not only the country's future, but regional politics for years to come. Editorial perspective, risks, precedent, and global implications beyond Venezuela itself. The events have ignited a broader debate about international norms and the future use of force. Legal scholars warn that the reported capture of a sitting head of state by a foreign power, if confirmed and upheld, could weaken long-standing principles of sovereignty and non-intervention. Supporters of the action argue that exceptional circumstances require exceptional measures, particularly when governments are accused of transnational crime. Critics counter that such actions risk normalizing regime change by force and may be cited by other powers to justify similar interventions elsewhere. The episode is already being studied closely in diplomatic circles as a potential turning point in post-Cold War international relations. Impact on Latin America-U.S. relations between Washington and Latin America are expected to face renewed strain. Even governments critical of Maduro have expressed discomfort with unilateral military action, fearing domestic backlash and regional instability. Public opinion across the region appears sharply divided. While some view the move as overdue accountability, others see it as a return to an era of U.S. interventionism. How Washington manages post-crisis diplomacy may determine whether trust can be rebuilt or further eroded. Voices from the diaspora of Venezuelans living abroad, many of whom fled economic collapse and political repression, have reacted with intense emotion. In cities across the Americas and Europe, diaspora communities held vigils, demonstrations, and forums debating whether the moment represents liberation or the start of another uncertain chapter. For many, the dominant feeling is cautious anticipation. "We want justice," said one community organizer, "but we also want peace. We don't want our families back home to suffer more." The road ahead. What ultimately defines this moment will not be the operation itself, but what follows. Whether violence is avoided, whether civilian life stabilizes, whether Venezuelans are given a genuine say in their future, history shows that removing leaders is far easier than rebuilding nations. The coming weeks will test not only Venezuela's institutions, but the credibility of international promises to support recovery, democracy, and reconciliation. Closing note, Venezuela now stands at a historic crossroads. The outcome will depend on restraint, leadership, and the willingness of all sides, domestic and international, to prioritize the well-being of ordinary citizens over political victory. The world is watching, but for Venezuelans, this is not a geopolitical story. It is their daily reality, unfolding hour by hour. Opinion and expert commentary. As the situation continues to evolve, former diplomats, military analysts, and regional experts are offering sharply differing interpretations of what this moment represents. Some analysts argue that the operation, if followed by restraint and multilateral engagement, could mark the end of Venezuela's long political paralysis. They point to historical cases where sudden leadership change opened space for reform, provided institutions were quickly stabilized. Others are far more skeptical. They warn that externally driven power shifts often produce unintended consequences, including internal power struggles, economic shocks, and long-term dependency on foreign support. The danger, one regional expert noted, is mistaking removal of a leader for resolution of a system. Information war and competing narratives. Alongside events on the ground, an intense information battle is underway. Conflicting claims, leaked videos, anonymous statements, and social media rumors have made it difficult for the public to distinguish confirmed facts from propaganda. Independent journalists face severe limitations due to restricted access, safety concerns, and communication disruptions. Media watchdogs caution audiences to rely on verified reporting and avoid unconfirmed claims that could inflame tensions or spread panic. Role of international mediation. There is growing pressure for neutral international mediation to prevent escalation. Several non-aligned countries and international organizations have reportedly offered to facilitate dialogue between Venezuelan factions. Diplomats emphasize that mediation could help establish temporary governance arrangements, secure humanitarian corridors, reduce the risk of retaliation or civil conflict. Whether such efforts succeed will depend largely on cooperation from domestic power centers and restraint by external actors.